Hello, everybody. Welcome to Unbiased America Live. We're here with our usual panel. We have Grant Phillips all the way on the end there, who's using his phone because his computer is I think it was the display model at Costco that he took home, and it has some bugs in it. He's from We Are Capitalists and the Modern Libertarian. We have Kevin Ryan, who has the American flag behind him today, and his French doors, as well as his fireplace, in his 1% enclave in Kennebunkport, Maine.
It's all a backdrop.
And we have Michael Lee, also from Unbiased America, and the newest admin, also being constitutional. I wanted to throw in our new little page there. It's getting some attention. And we have a special guest today. We have Joseph Bast, who is the president and CEO of the Heartland Institute. I wanted to get into some of the criticism of the Heartland Institute before we start, because I had people inbox me about this when I mentioned that you were going to be on the show. They said that that the Heartland Institute supports what was it? Yeah, cigarettes. You're a big fan of cigarettes, and that you were paid off by Philip Morris and the Koch brothers. Is there any truth to that?
No, there's no truth to that. And yeah, if you go on our Wikipedia profile, you're going to see all these accusations all lined up because various leftist activists took over our site and put all that garbage on the site. The truth is, we got started 32 years ago. Okay, I was the first employee. We get 90% of our funding from individuals, individual contributions, 10% from corporations. Philip Morris, oil companies, drug companies, telephone companies, recycled paper greetings companies, all contributed to us off and on over the years. But corporate funding is only about 10% of the total amount that we get. We never worked with tobacco companies to deny that cigarettes are bad for you. What we do, which is what lots of conservative and libertarian groups do, we point out that the nannies exaggerate the threat of smoking and secondhand smoke in order to whip up this public health crisis, to tax the hell out of smokers so that they can take that money and spend it on other things. Mm-hmm. And we say, hey, that's not fair. I mean, come on, $5 a pack for cigarettes, that is way in excess of the social cost of smoking. So look at the numbers, look at the actual research, go to our website and check out what we have to say about this. I think you're going to agree. It's all very reasonable stuff.
Uh-huh. I mean, some people would consider that fear-mongering. I mean, next, they'll ban salt and 32-ounce sodas. You know what I mean?
It's a slippery road.
It is
yeah,
a really
that's already
slippery
happened
road.
in New York, obviously, yeah.
You can't have salt now either, You can't have a large soda. Thank you, government, for keeping my heart healthy.
So if we're pointing that out, we get accused of being stooges for big corporations, and it's just not true. And real quickly on the Koch thing, Kochs haven't contributed to us since the year 2000. They gave us one gift since then, $25,000 for a healthcare project. Mm-hmm. We're a $6 million a year organization. Mm-hmm. The Kochs just don't fund us, and right now we have a policy of not soliciting or accepting any funding from them.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems to be this tactic of the left, rather than engage in any sort of arguments or rebuttal. It's poison the well, attack the person, ad hominems, and so on and so forth. And this happens a lot to me in academia, specifically from the left. It's instead of addressing my arguments, I'm a bigot, I'm a racist, I'm a homophobe, hate women. Whatever it is, if there's something that they could name, I hate it, apparently. So, and that happens to all of us here constantly, rather than engage in arguments.
Yeah, I'm afraid it's true. And not to keep interrupting you.
No, go ahead.
The reason they do that is they do focus group meetings on all these issues, on health care, on school reform, on climate change. The strongest arguments they can make are ad hominem attacks on the other side. If I can say, you're not a real scientist, 20 years ago you took speakers honoraria from Philip Morris, so you're not to be trusted. In focus group meetings, that works. That works better than an argument. That works better than addressing the facts. They know that, which is why their whole toolbox now of tactics is ad hominem attacks.
Right, and that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to read, the Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming right here. I want to read off the credentials a little bit of the people that wrote it, so they can't attack the source and say they're not real scientists. I have Craig D. Idso, who's a PhD, a climatologist, is one of the authors of this chapter. Robert M. Carter, who is a PhD, who's a geologist, and S. Fred Singer, a PhD, who is a physicist. So they have, people from varying expertise commenting on. It's not just one person with expertise in one area of climate change. And I wanted to get to the 97% consensus that we constantly hear. I think it's on NASA's website. It's on a couple of other websites, and I mean, I think, and going through the, I've read articles in National Review and other publications of debunking the consensus. I think it's been thoroughly debunked, but they did a really great job, and specifically in this chapter. And one of the key findings in the chapter was there is no survey or study showing a consensus on the most important scientific issues in the climate change debate. Now, some of the studies I saw, they use such shoddy methodology as a Google search, like searching for the words in the abstract. Can you give us some background on where they get this 97% number?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So if you go to the NASA website, they have a statement up there. 97% of scientists believe that global warming is man-made and would be bad. And there's a footnote. You go to that footnote number 1. They cite 4 sources. One of them is a socialist historian. 2 of them are college students' term papers that they wrote. I am not kidding you, term papers. And the fourth one, the final one, is an Australian blogger. It's this kind of wacky guy who created skepticalscience.com. That's all he has is a website. There's no organization. There's no board of directors. There's no publications. This guy's a blogger who's an adamant alarmist on global warming. So he's devoted his whole life to attacking global warming skeptics. Those are the 4 sources that your government, NASA, is citing as evidence that there's a consensus on global warming.
My next question, that's interesting. My next question is somewhat on that, and it's the distinction between whether that scientists would largely agree, correct me if I'm wrong, that some warming is occurring, or warming is occurring, correct?
Yes,
and
that's right.
And the real debate here is about man-made global warming and whether it's tethered to output or CO2 emissions.
Exactly right.
So that's the real problem. So you have here what are known as the alarmists, right? The people that are saying that, this warming's gonna, the polar bears are dying. I stubbed my toe. The Earth's coming to an end, yada yada yada. And then you have the skeptics that are saying, hey, wait a minute, we understand some warming is occurring, but there has been warming there has been higher concentrations of CO2 in the past with a lower rate of warming, and at lower, the Earth has been at lower temperatures in the past. Am I incorrect?
No, that's a very good summary, of where it stands. The real debate is how big is the impact? And is it big enough for us to want to do something about it? And what's the most cost-effective way, the most efficient response to the apparent problem? Okay. That's where the real debate is.
So all this talk about the warming, does anybody have a baseline temperature for where the Earth operates at its most optimal level? I mean, I understand the human body's at 98.6 degrees. I mean, you deviate a certain amount away from that, you're going to have hypothermia, or you're going to burn up, right? You have a terrible fever. Most people, a question seldom ever asked is, why do we presuppose that the Earth's climate is static, or the Earth's temperature is static, as opposed to dynamic?
You're absolutely right. What is the optimum temperature? And why would we assume that the temperature 20 years ago or 30 years ago was better than it is today? What we know is the temperature is remarkably stable, or has been since the last ice age. So we're going on 15,000 years, I believe, between ice ages, and it's pretty good. But it only takes about a 4-degree change for us to go into a new ice age. So it's got to stay stable, otherwise we're going to have some pretty serious problems. Historically, during these past 15,000 years, the warm periods are when humanity really flourished. So all the temples that were being built, these were all during warm periods. The cathedrals, that was warm period. Crops are growing great. People were living longer. You could build cathedrals. And then when it got colder, you saw it all slows down. Economic growth slows down. People don't live as long. Wars are caused during cold periods. So history shows us warmer is better. The small amount of warming that we had at the end of the 20th century was beneficial. There's no question the benefits exceeded the costs in the 20th century. And the best economic models on this say that's going to be the case for the 21st century too. Even if you accept the other side's science, even if you accept their forecast of warming, the benefits exceed the cost for at least 100 years, probably 150 years.
So even if you accept the... Go ahead, Kevin.
Sorry, a perfect time to ask the question I want to ask. Given that, you've heard Bernie Sanders mention recently, and other people mention that terrorism and global strife is related to global warming. I mean, if you look at the cost-benefit analysis and so forth, I mean, is there a point to be made that somehow global warming is causing the strife in the Middle East or around the world? I mean, in your opinion?
In my opinion, the impact of climate on all of this is very small, and it's probably positive and not negative. So a little bit of warming, more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere means better crops, right? It's food for plants, so you get less hunger. Those are things that lead to peace. It's when you get cold temperatures, especially before we had paved roads, when you had cold temperatures, roads became mud. Markets shrunk. If you remember your Economics 101 course, the size of markets determines the division of labor. Division of labor determines productivity. So in periods of cold weather, the whole world's economy shrank dramatically, and people would starve to death. So warming causes prosperity. Prosperity generally means less war. People have more at stake. They don't need to go to war. They're not as quick to leave their homes and their families and their successful businesses in order to go fight in some foreign land. Now, I'll say one quick thing, kind of a footnote to all of this. There are winners and losers anytime climate changes, whether it's natural or man-made. So if the whole world is warming up, there's going to be some parts of the world where that warming is disadvantageous. It might cause more droughts. It might cause crops to fail. And so that could be a cause of local stress. It could lead to civil war. I'm not denying that climate change never affects war. But I'm saying overall, if you look back over history, warmer is more peaceful.
That's a good. Those are good points. I didn't think a lot of those. I wanted to ask one question because you mentioned Ice Age, and I think Ice Ages happen about every 10,000 years on average. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's a statistic I heard.
I thought it was more like 17,000 years.
Okay. Yeah. Because I've heard people claim that if we should at this point be transitioning into an ice age, and if that's the case, why is there warming, and can that be attributed to CO2?
I think, yeah, I've read some of that same thing. Mm-hmm. There is speculation that if it weren't for mankind, mm-hmm. we might already be going into an ice age. Mm-hmm. It's possible because certainly carbon dioxide levels are higher as a result of the human presence. It's a greenhouse gas. It's probably had some effect on moderating temperature changes. Mm-hmm. I doubt that it's had enough effect to actually ward off an ice age.
Exactly. A lot of people too, when they think of CO2 or carbon dioxide, certainly like if you look at jurisprudence and court opinions, think that it's a pollutant, and the president mainly will say carbon is a pollutant, and you hear a lot of this rhetoric. And I don't think people understand that carbon itself is the basis of all life. I mean, when scientists, if they're looking for life in other areas of the universe or on planets, they're first looking for carbon. And that CO2 is needed in order to get oxygen. Like you said, plants need CO2. The Earth has a means of homeostasis, just like a body. I think that there would be certain feedbacks to this increased CO2. Am I wrong in any of that assessment? I mean, is CO2 this boogeyman that we really should be terrified of?
I don't think you're wrong about any of that, and I shudder every time I hear President Obama say carbon pollution. Yes. We got to lower carbon pollution. Oh, come on! You're talking to us like we're kindergartners.
Right.
I mean, what an insult to the average guy's intelligence. Say carbon dioxide, Mr. President.
Right.
I mean, come on. We're big boys and girls. We understand dioxide.
So you think it's rhetorical? He's saying it because he doesn't want to conflate, he doesn't want to confuse people by saying carbon dioxide.
And it's just the opposite. He wants to confuse people into thinking that he's talking about soot or carbon monoxide. scary stuff. Carbon is
Right.
bad. I don't want to breathe carbon. I'm happy to breathe carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide keeps me
Right.
alive, but most people don't know that. So when they hear carbon, they think of soot. So it's a really cheap trick, I think, that the other side plays with vocabulary. Carbon dioxide is not a pollution.
Mhm.
The EPA decided that it could regulate it under the Clean Air Act. So legally, as you were saying, the court said, okay, EPA, if you can find what's called an endangerment finding, if you can suggest that carbon dioxide is endangering human health, then you can regulate it under the Clean Air Act.
Mhm.
So legally, in that sense, it's a pollutant. But in terms of real science, in terms of public health, no, it's not at all.
My last question, and then I'll let Kevin get some questions, and then I'll open it up to questions for the panel. Um, the United States itself, irrespective of what we do on climate and how much we regulate our own economy, will that produce any positive effects on CO2 levels over the next century? I mean, if we act unilaterally and we start clamping down on our own production and having what do they call those carbon taxes? I forget, cap and trade and so on and so forth that will limit output, and will that have any impact on CO2 levels?
Virtually none. Virtually none. And for a couple of reasons. The United States is no longer the major producer of carbon dioxide. China has overtaken us. Our emissions are actually already declining. They're declining partly because natural gas is taking over as the fuel of choice to generate electricity, thanks to fracking. It's also declining because we're electrifying our economy. So stuff that used to be powered with a diesel generator is now being plugged into the wall and just being generated by a much more efficient and emission-controlled power plant. So our emissions are falling. The more we try to tamp down our emissions, the more they rise in other countries.
Right.
So whenever we shut down a steel plant in the United States, China opens 2 of them because they're less efficient, and they produce twice as much carbon dioxide.
Right. So if we decrease production, China will take over that sector of the market, and they're less efficient, so they'll create more pollution.
Correct.
So in fact,
Correct.
we'll be adding to pollutants if we were to regulate, cap and trade and regulate our whatever our perceived carbon pollution is.
That's correct.
Okay.
And that's the big reason why trying to reduce our emissions doesn't have much effect on the global stuff. The other thing is, the amount of carbon dioxide in the air keeps going up, but the impact that it has on temperature gets less and less over time. It's saturation. At a certain point, they use the image of painting a window with white paint, and the first layer cuts 90% of the light. Next one cuts another 10%, and next one, by the 20th coat, you're not making any difference. Well, we've reached about the 19th coat in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You can double the concentration of carbon dioxide, you're only going to increase temperatures by some small fraction of a degree.
Wow. Okay.
So it's diminishing returns.
I was going to say
we're not getting much impact.
Okay. I'm sorry, Kevin. One more. I want to get this one in. The incentives of the IPCC and a lot of these the alarmists, and why are they coming out with a lot of this? We're all going to die. The polar bears are going to die. The sea caps will be gone soon. We're going to have our oceans are going to overtake the coastline. Do they have some sort of? I mean, going through the chapter, you see that they're getting paid. They're getting grant money based on coming to a lot of these alarmist conclusions, and that the more they go into these alarmist claims, the more money they receive to do more research, and the more grants that they get. And if they were to say, hey, global warming isn't a problem, that a lot of this grant money would dry up. Is that part of the reason we're getting a lot of these studies and we keep getting fed a lot of this stuff?
I think that is part of the reason, but only part of the reason. I think there's a lot of honest, sincere scientists who aren't just in it for the money, who truly believe what they're doing. But it's a tough game. If you're a scientist, you're being paid to find a human impact on climate. I mean, you're literally being paid to find that. If your study doesn't find a climate impact, a human impact on climate, it's not going to get published. It's not going to get funded. You're not going to be able to bring the grant into your department. You're not going to get tenure. Now you can be the most honest guy in the world, and you can look at this, you study it, and you say, you know what, I can't find a human impact on climate, so I'm not going to publish. Well, then go join the sociology department, because you're not going to make much money, right, and you're not going to get tenure in the biology department.
So just to clarify, you're saying that there's a lot of good people that are climate alarmists, but they have this incentive structure where they have to disseminate the climate change, alarmism and ideology to a degree.
That's correct. I think it is, for many of them, it's a matter of self-interest, whether they acknowledge it or not.
Okay.
I'm not saying they're dishonest. I'm not saying that they're fudging data in order to get grants. I mean, it's the business that you're in. If your job is to dig ditches, you'd better dig ditches.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I've had to do that more than a few times. Go ahead, Kevin. I know you got a ton of questions.
Sure. No, I just have a couple. I was reading an article on your website yesterday by Kenneth Arts talking about whether or not the GOP candidates remain global climate change skeptics, or whether or not they're eventually or basically becoming more accepting of the notion that the government has to intervene. And I will say this, at least anecdotally, but on sort of a wider scale, I've seen a lot of people who have changed a bit lately, people on the right and sort of libertarians who've come to accept that global warming is actually happening and it's occurring. And I also take this stance myself, and I notice you've mentioned something similar, but the problem is, and you mentioned it earlier, that it's not the crisis that we think it is. It's not the end of the world that we think it is, like you said earlier. But the problem with that is when people deny that global warming exists, which a large majority on the right do, what ends up happening is you end up boycotting discussions of potential solutions if the problem becomes worse, if you understand what I'm saying. So the only people really discussing what to do about global warming are the people who want to ramp up government spending. I mean, you're literally looking at, it's the biggest golden goose for government maybe ever is global warming. Mm-hmm. And they want to take taxes, wealth transfer taxes. They want to have developmental restraint. I mean, and why not at least acknowledge, and I'm not saying you don't, but why not at least acknowledge that global warming exists, but the solutions might be a hell of a lot easier and a hell of a lot less costly than, stopping our development or trillions of dollars a year in developmental wealth, taxes and so forth. I think there's something to be said, and I'll let you answer after 1 second, but there was a line in the latest IPCC report that said, modeling indicates that new technology has the potential to substantially offset global temperature rise. And what that means is we might not need all these great carbon taxes, all these huge wealth transfer taxes. There might actually be a way to address the issue scientifically, just like mankind has always done when faced with a crisis. And as soon as they started mentioning that, everybody attacked it. It's called geoengineering. Everybody's been attacking geoengineering as a solution, and I think it's because government doesn't want to give up its golden egg. You know what I mean? It's the goose that laid the golden egg. What do you think? Have you heard of what I'm referring to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've put your finger on 3 or 4 really important things. If there was an inexpensive technological solution, guys like me maybe would oppose it because, hey, I'm in the business of being a skeptic. And the guys who are the alarmists would oppose it because they don't want the crisis to end on a fizzle. They want to change the whole economy. They want a good crisis, right? So the middle is empty. And it's a tragedy, and it hurts the conversation. It really does. As a libertarian, I'm pro-technology. And yet I go around the country saying we shouldn't subsidize wind and solar. Wind and solar aren't really necessary, aren't really the future technology for energy. I would love to be able to say, yeah, let's focus on solving the problems that wind and solar currently have. That's a much more positive pro-technology, pro-innovation, pro-science point of view. If we can if we can fix battery technology, if we can reduce their cost by half, reduce their size by half, and double their efficiency, that's the goal, the 222. If we could do that, wind and solar could replace a much larger percentage of fossil fuel generated power in America. And as libertarians, we ought to be celebrating that, right? And saying, yeah, let's do more research. Let's push some new technology. Let's solve this problem. Let's not just debate it to death, but let's actually solve it. But we don't do that. And the reason we don't do that is because this debate has become so polarized. When the left, honestly, when the left got involved, they saw this issue and they said, hey, this is our rice bowl. This is how we can justify our whole agenda, guys. All we have to do is say yes to this. And I was there. I mean, in the early 1990s, come on, nobody knew the science. The IPCC hadn't even put out its report yet. Every environmental group lined up and said this was a crisis. What are these guys, geniuses? They're not even scientists. And they were all concluding that the scientific debate is over, global warming is a crisis, we got to do something about it. And I said, no. Obviously, you guys have not looked at the science. Obviously, you're leaping to a conclusion. Policy is ahead of the science here. The wagon is in front of the horses. We got to open up the hood and we got to take a serious look at that. And so it's tragic. I really appreciate the way you phrased the question and the situation, because I don't like being in a polarized debate. I don't like this impression that we actually want the debate to continue. We don't want to find a middle-of-the-road solution. But I think the other side has forced us into this. I mean, they have just marched so far to one side that we have no choice but to finally just stand still and say, you know what, we're not going to compromise with you guys any further. We're not going to concede any of this stuff, and we're not going to adopt your agenda.
Okay, I just want to cut in really quickly, and to that point, I forgot to ask you this earlier, but clearly the left is seeing this as a means to advocate for more planning in the economy, correct? They can get more control over the economy, more control over how we allocate resources, this radical egalitarian idea of income gaps and income inequality. And I just wanted to ask your opinion before we get to Mike and Grant about the hearings that Sheldon Whitehouse had. There were Senate hearings he had with Loretta Lynch, and they were, I think, at one point, you would know about this, they had, for cigarettes, they had RICO inquiries into the cigarette companies, and he kind of advocated for the same thing about these climate deniers, and that they wanted to have some sort of action, make denying an actionable offense, that they can prosecute these businesses. Can you explain a little bit of that?
Yeah, he didn't kind of suggest that, he called for it.
Mm-hmm.
This is outrageous. This is incredible. Are we still in the United States of America? Do we still have a Constitution? The U.S. Department of Justice has talked to the FBI about starting an investigation of the Heartland Institute and the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation and the Competitive Enterprise Institute about what did we know and when did we know it? Were we paid to lie about global warming? Are we hiding the truth about global warming? This is so incredible. I mean, I'm really free speech, an open scientific debate. You're going to threaten me with RICO for speaking the truth and giving scientists a platform on which to put out their opinions? This is just outrageous. It's over the top.
To me, and looking at it colloquially, it seems that there's more evidence that the left is using the climate change issue as a means to maintain, or to control the economy, than there is that CO2 and warming is harmful to the planet.
Absolutely. They're using it to raise money. I mean, look at the direct mail letters that you get from the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Natural Resources Defense Council, Sierra Club, Greenpeace. I mean, these guys are making hundreds of millions of dollars a year scaring the public about a scientific threat that, frankly, is not well established, that doesn't exist. You want to look at fraud? For cripe's sakes, audit these guys. Look at their fundraising letters. Compare them to the scientific literature. We did that. I mean, there's enough evidence in there to put these guys behind bars, I would think. So why in the world are they looking at us?
Go ahead, Kevin.
It's astonishing to me.
I do have other questions, but if the other guys want to continue on global warming, my questions are on a different subject.
Oh, yeah, Mike and Grant, do you have any questions on global warming for Joe?
Yeah, I have a question for
Go ahead, Mike.
Well, Kevin kind of already touched on this. I've said a lot that the debate on global warming is in the wrong place. The left likes to tell us that the debate is over, and it's like a conversation ender. You can't even make a relevant point because the debate's over, and it's the way they shut up opposition. But I do have concerns about people that share kind of the same ideology as me, conservatives, libertarians, that are deniers. And the debate, to me, it is centered in the wrong place. You have one side that says this thing isn't happening at all. It's completely bogus. It doesn't exist whatsoever. And then you have the other side that says the debate's over. 97% of climate scientists agree it's a problem, and that's where the debate is. And I've always said that if we as conservatives, if we as libertarians are going to actually be able to stop what the left is doing, to stop some of these harmful government programs that could ruin the economy, I feel like the first step is we have to get some of the people that we're allies with to at least acknowledge that this thing exists, and then we can go from there and start debating solutions and why it's not as big as a problem as the left says. But we can't even get to that point if we can't get our own people to admit that it even exists at all. And do you think that's a problem, or is there a way that we can solve that?
It's really difficult to solve, and it is a problem. It has two parts. When you say people are deniers, on our side there are deniers, that can refer to two different things, scientific denial and I would say political denial. In the science debate, a denier, as opposed to a lukewarmer, we call ourselves lukewarmers. We believe that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It has some effect on the climate. Human beings are responsible for the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's probably going to cause about 1 degree of warming over the next century, maybe 1.5 degrees. Probably the benefits are better than the costs, but there will be some costs, and we should probably do something about it. But we're probably already doing too much about it because this problem is so small compared to malaria or polluted water in third world countries or any of a number of other issues that are so much bigger than this problem. So I think I'm kind of in the middle with this. Okay, I'm not denying that global warming is caused by man, but I just say it's a really small problem, and we're way overboard on this. And we need to pivot back. We need to take our foot off the gas on all these expensive programs to try to reduce our emissions and kind of put this in the context of other environmental problems and other social needs. Now, in the scientific, that's kind of the political positioning. On the science side, I have a lot of respect for the hardcore deniers, because when you listen to these guys, what they're telling you is 30 years ago, nobody thought we could even come up with a temperature for the whole planet. How do you get an average temperature for a planet? The climate is a dynamic system. It's changing all over the place. So when it warms up here, it's cooling down here. What sense does it make to average the temperature at the Antarctica with the Sierra Desert? And you know, I kind of listen to these guys and I say, wow, you know, you're right. And they say, you lukewarmers just fell for this idea that you could somehow come up with an average temperature. And then they say, how do we know there's been any warming at all? You're trusting the other guys. You know, Phil Jones has the temperature record that we're supposed to all be using. Phil Jones says he lost the original data. Okay, his basement flooded. It's all gone. All we've got is his adjusted, homogenized data. And we're supposed to believe this. And I sit back and I say, no. I think the moderate position is to say we can estimate global temperature, and we should trust Phil to tell us what the temperatures are and how they're rising over time. And the deniers say, Joe, you're just arguing between, you know, the end zone and the 10-yard line, and you're going to lose. They keep throwing the ball into the end zone, and eventually they're going to score. What you need to do is say, this is bogus, man. There's a whole field that we got to play on, and we got to push back against these guys. So I have a lot of respect for the deniers. I think they have some good points that have been pushed out of this debate by other scientists who want to appear moderate, who are looking for that middle ground that we've been talking about. So I have respect for all these guys.
It sounds a lot like the Republican Party, to be honest, pushing out the constitutionalists. You know, they're calling them purists and so on and so forth. I guess that happens that everybody that in politics they call it, you know, the average voter hypothesis. You know what I mean? You're moving to the middle to get that that average person to look for that that median. But go ahead, Grant. I know you have a question, and then we'll get into Kevin's next. Kevin will change the subject here a little bit. Go ahead. You're on mute, Grant.
All right, so I have two things. The first thing, I listened to a podcast by Bjorn Lundberg the other day. He has a couple books out about climate change and global warming. And what you were just saying about taking an average global temperature, how difficult, if not impossible, that is. One of the points he makes is that after the fall of the Soviet Union, you had all of these states in the coldest part of the world that just sort of separated off, and because they weren't really nation states at all, they didn't have really a stable government, let alone any tax revenue, and they had to start making cuts. And some of the first things that get cut were weather stations in the coldest parts of the world. And he said, and the point he was making is that right around the fall of the Soviet Union is really when where some of this data is coming from. Do you think that affected the scientific outcome at all? I was just listening to this morning when I heard that you were going to come on, and that sparked my thought on that immediately.
We had a talk here at the Heartland Institute just last night by Fred Goldberg, who's a great expert on this stuff, and one of his slides showed the temperature record and the number of temperature stations. And the temperatures all of a sudden started to go up. At the very same time, the number of stations went down. At the same time, the Soviet Union was collapsing, and all these northern hemisphere temperature stations, Siberia, that whole area, they just shut them all down. Heck of a coincidence. I mean, you look at that graph up there on the screen and you say, wow, I mean, really? And the other side says, well, we control for that. Statistically, we can take that into account. The temperature change was recorded in stations that weren't just up in that area. And, really smart guys, I think Richard Lindzen, for example, would say, yeah, they took that into account. That does not discredit the database. So,
and another thing that I've heard from, I guess, climate critics is that as the world has become more urbanized, we have higher temperature pockets in smaller parts of the world. New York City, London, now China's very, very urbanized. Brazil became very urbanized to the, I guess, like late 70s into the 80s. And that causes these spikes, these outliers in the data. So when you're looking at a global temperature, you're really just, you have your sort of like, you have the center of your bell curve, but then you have these outliers that are, multiple standard deviations away, and they could be pulling the temperature up even further. Was that also covered in your discussion?
Absolutely right. Yeah. Some of these volumes of research that we did, they're called Climate Change Reconsidered, and they're all free online at climatechangereconsidered.org. There's a whole chapter on what's called the urban heat island effect. And in a city, you've got all this concrete, all this masonry stuff, you got all these air conditioners and furnaces and cars, jet planes, all this stuff, and it generates and holds on to heat. And there's a 2 or 3 degree difference from the suburbs into the cities. And so a good way to know if the urban heat island effect is responsible for what we think is a warming trend is to separate out the surface-based stations for urban stations, suburban stations, and rural stations. Okay? If I could show you the temperature trend in the United States just for rural stations, that would be a much better measure of whether or not there's been any warming. And in fact, the rural stations in the United States show no warming. The suburban stations show a little bit of warming. The urban stations are the ones that show all the warming. I think it's very clearly evidence that much of the warming that we think is caused by carbon dioxide is actually an artifact of urban heat island effects. So it's not carbon dioxide at all.
And my last thing was to your point earlier about technology and how libertarians should encourage technology. I work for a manufacturing company, so we naturally have a lot of waste, scrap metal, coolants, lubricants, everything. For us, that's a cost. That waste, it's a cost to society to dispose of it. It's also a cost to us to get rid of it, and it's a cost to our customers because they have to pay for it. We spend every waking moment trying to reduce that cost, trying to reduce the pollution that we're essentially emitting by sending scrap barrels out. We might not see it, but it's going somewhere. And we do that not because we care about the planet, it's because we care about our bottom line. And by reducing our bottom line, we effectively, in a way, reduce our pollutants. And I see that happening in a lot of ways. And like you said, a lot of it has to do with technology. You know, we develop a new process, buy a new piece of equipment, whatever it is. So that point you made about pursuing technological advances to solve problems, I completely agree with you on that.
Yeah, I really wish the debate could get back to that because there's great success stories going on with companies like yours. There are bad actors as well. So when you're saying we can save money by recycling, reusing, downsizing and stuff, well, maybe you could save money by throwing it into the river too. And that happens. And so, you know, we do need laws. We need an EPA, a state EPA at least, that can enforce these rules and hold you accountable if your pollution ends up damaging my water supply. So as libertarians, we know that there's a great way to handle that. It's called property rights. We treat pollution like trespass. So you burn leaves in your backyard, the smoke goes into my yard, I can pick up the phone and call and have the cops come and tell you to stop doing that because you are literally trespassing on my property.
Or the neighbor can compensate you for the smoke going into their yard.
I could walk over and say, you know, either you put the fire out or give me $20 so that I can go to the bar and have a couple of drinks while you're burning your leaves.
I have to get Ronald Coase in here a little bit. He's one of my favorite economists. Kevin, I'm sorry. Mike has one more question, and then we'll pivot to you. Sorry, Mike. Kevin, go ahead, Mike.
I just wanted to ask one thing, and I think you probably know more about this than me. I haven't spent quite as much time on this topic, but I've read a couple articles, and I was watching a documentary, and one of the points that people have made is there hasn't been much warming since the end of the 20th century. It's kind of stabilized, and I've heard the point made that we were in a solar minimum during that time, and then when that comes out, and we're coming out of it now, that the problem will actually be more exaggerated because it was kind of masked by the solar minimum. Can you speak to that at all? Is there any truth to that?
The science can get kind of complicated on that, and I'm no expert on it. I can tell you there's been almost no warming. It's been very slight for the last 18 years. They say 18 years and 8 months. We just had an El Niño, so temperatures have gone up very recently. But that's still well within the range of kind of this natural cycle. We have been in a period of less solar activity, and there's a lot of scientists who believe that that explains why the temperatures are relatively flat. There's a lot of scientists like Fred Goldberg last night was predicting cooling for the next 20 years. And he thinks that we're still seeing fewer and fewer sunspots and less evidence of solar activity. So we're not at the end of that. It's not going to start increasing again. At least scientists like Fred and some of the Russian scientists think that we're going to see more and more declining solar activity and actually enter into a little ice age. Yeah, and I don't know how many scientists share that, but I think it's a 50-50 chance that the next 10 years is going to see a little bit of warming or a little bit of cooling. The best, most reliable forecast is probably no change for the next 5 or 10 years.
I read that in the book too. That point was in the book as well, in the chapter that I have. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, I just want to talk about what you actually do for a second. The University of Pennsylvania has an annual report on think tanks, such as Heartland, such as your own. And I read an interesting line in it that got me thinking. It says, the aggregate data from 2014 shows that 39% of American think tanks identify as independents, 32% as liberal, and only 23% as conservative. Is there a ideology gap? Do you have trouble fundraising, I guess, compared to your to some of the more liberal think tanks? And I mean, are we having a problem getting research funding for conservative or libertarian programs and institutes such as your own?
I'm familiar with the survey. I'm not familiar with the statistics that you just ran. That's pretty interesting. I would not have guessed that there are fewer conservative think tanks, self-identified conservative think tanks, than liberal think tanks. A lot of the liberal think tanks are heavily funded by foundations, and the biggest foundations in the United States and in the world have been essentially taken over by the left. So Pew Charitable Trust used to be conservative. Now they just give solely to left-wing think tanks and advocacy groups. Same with the MacArthur Foundation. Lots of these foundations. So the number of foundations willing to fund a conservative or a libertarian think tank is decreasing over time. I've certainly noticed that. We used to get 10-15% of our income from corporations. I think that's falling over time because corporations are afraid to be identified with a libertarian or a conservative organization, whereas they don't seem to be afraid to be identified with a left-wing group. So Coca-Cola was raising money for the Natural Resources Defense Council. Pretty sure I got this right, with the polar bears on the cans at Christmas time.
Yeah.
So I think it was for every can of Coke you bought, they gave a penny to Natural Resources Defense Council. Well, how many people know that's one of the most radical left-wing advocacy groups in the world? I mean, these guys are crazy. I mean, they want to shut down all forestry. They want to basically outlaw cars and trucks in America. They want us all to live in little apartments with mass transit-oriented transportation. But hey, it's fine for Coke to identify with an organization like that. But a Pfizer or a General Motors or a Bayer, they don't want to identify with the Heartland Institute. We're too controversial.
That's amazing.
So, I mean,
So we're hurt by that.
Is there a reason that the right? I mean, I understand what you're saying, but is there a way that the right can sort of take back some of the narrative? I mean, because you're right. You're absolutely right. You see much more in terms of the left being able to successfully push its narrative, be it truthful or false or whatever, than you do on the right. And it seems to be a growing struggle that I've noticed. Is there a way to push back on this war, in your opinion?
Well, there certainly is. Yeah, it's interesting how you introduce this question. It's a new kind of way of thinking about it. Think tanks like the Heartland Institute, state-based think tanks, Reason Foundation, all these guys, I think we do good work. I think we're getting better over time. I think the internet helps us communicate with larger audiences. So we've got advantages. We're making a difference. We might be better than we were 10 years ago. But I do believe that we are pushing a rock up a hill, whereas the other side is kind of just kicking it down the hill. It's harder for us. It is institutionally harder for us to win. And I think it's harder for us for a couple of reasons. Most libertarians do not want my job. They do not want to have to manage 30 people, 40 people. They don't want to fundraise. They don't want to do marketing. Most libertarians and conservatives, frankly, are smarter and more talented than liberals. And so their opportunity costs are higher. I mean, I should have gone to law school. I think I'd have made a great judge. So I have sacrificed to take this job. And
well,
a lot of
you
people
didn't go to law school.
and a lot of the people that I try to recruit, you know, they have big opportunity costs. They could go into business, and they know it. And they could make 10 times as much as what I'm offering to pay them to work in a think tank. Libertarians are individualistic. We don't like to work together. So you got guys who want to just go out and give speeches all the time, guys who want to write a book, and they just don't want to be bothered by working in an organization with lots of people that they think aren't as smart as they are and spend all their time editing other people's stuff or helping other people achieve their goals. This is all what liberals love to do. We've done some joint projects with liberal organizations. We did one on tax increment financing, and it was a real eye-opening experience because they wanted to have meetings every week, and they would sit around this table for hours drinking coffee and eating donuts and talking about nothing. And I said, don't you guys have to go to work? Don't we have to get something done? And oh, no, you know, this is what they do all day. Honestly, this is what they do all day. So these left-wing think tanks, I often say we're blessed by having incompetent opponents, because if I had their money, holy cow, could I make a difference? But these guys, I mean, they have lunch breaks all the time. Their whole day seems to be meetings. They love to have meetings. They never get anything done.
Just a quick follow-up. I know Mike has something too, but do you consider Heartland conservative, libertarian, a little combination of both? I read somewhere that you said you were a fallen libertarian. I wasn't quite sure what to make of that, but I mean, how do you describe the Heartland Institute?
I was really surprised. That was, I think, on our Wikipedia profile.
Yes, that's where I saw it.
And it says Joe Bast in 1994 described himself as a fallen away libertarian. And I'm trying to remember if or why I ever said that. I must have been in a bad mood at the time.
So your Wikipedia page really did get just completely trounced by opponents, didn't it?
It really did. But I'm a libertarian. I mean, I've been voting libertarian for president since Ed Clark in 1980. I think government needs to be about 10% of its current size, and I think a 50% cut right away would be a good start to that. So I'm a moderate libertarian. We used to say libertarians had all the good ideas, but conservatives had all the money. So libertarians and conservatives need to work together if they're going to create an organization. So the Heartland Institute from the beginning said we are a coalition of libertarians and conservatives. We avoid topics where libertarians and conservatives really disagree. So we don't get into social issues and we don't get into foreign policy. Now over time that's kind of changed. Now the libertarians have a lot of the money. The finance sector is largely libertarian and not conservative. So now the libertarians have the good ideas and the money. The conservatives have the grassroots outreach and voters. And if you want your idea to get beyond the 5%, I think you got to team up with conservatives. And that's
I think they have to do a better job of that than they have been lately. I mean, the conservatives and libertarians are more often at each other's throats than anything else. But Mike, I'm sorry, I knew you had a follow-up and I interrupted.
I just wanted to kind of touch a little bit on Kevin's point, and you were talking about how the left's been more effective, has been driving the narrative. And one thing that I've talked about a lot, and we talked about it after CPAC too, is that conservatives and libertarians, we're at an inherent disadvantage when it comes to driving the narrative. Economically, the left can promise something tangible. So, the government can do this for you. The government can do that for you. Whereas we're trying to tell them the free market can do this, but that's not as tangible. That doesn't sound like a solution to a lot of the population. And the same goes when we're talking about global warming. The left is offering a government solution. This is the rule of law. We can use force and we can stop this. Whereas the conservatives are either maybe it's not a big of problem. Maybe technology will solve the problem for us if it is a bigger problem. So we're in a disadvantage at driving the narrative because we don't offer anything that's really tangible to the general population. And I was just wondering, especially when it comes to global warming, because that's what we've been talking about, but is there a way that maybe conservatives can reclaim the narrative and package what we believe in something that's tangible to the masses to start driving that narrative back in our direction?
It's going to be hard, but we have to try. You're right. So we're all familiar with the seen versus the unseen, the great story. Yeah, so if we want to get rich, let's just throw rocks through people's windows and create lots of jobs for glass makers and window makers, replacing all of these windows. What you don't see is the loss of prosperity caused by breaking windows. A lot of economics is counterintuitive. Milton Friedman used to say one of our big disadvantages is that we have to make these same arguments over and over and over again, and we get bored with it. The minimum wage. Okay, who gets hurt by raising the minimum wage? All together, the poor, low-income people, African Americans. We have to make that argument every freaking year. And I've been at this for 32 years, and I'm tired of making that argument. I'm not going to write another op-ed piece that says that we shouldn't raise the minimum wage because the people who are hurt the most are the people with the least skills. And yet people forget. It's hard for us. Our ideas are counterintuitive. The other side has the advantage because their thought process is 2 steps. Here's a problem, here's a solution. Let's adopt the solution. The problem is you're putting pollution in the river. Let's ban companies from putting pollution in rivers. What could be simpler than that? And we come back and say, well, no, actually, it's more complicated than that. We want to protect people's rights. We don't want to discourage innovation. A little bit of pollution is probably not a bad thing, because trying to get rid of all pollution would be enormously expensive, and we would literally starve to death if we tried to ban all pollution. You know, I could prevent you from breathing because to some degree your breath is polluting my air. Do we really want that? No. But that requires critical thinking and multi-stage thinking. Maybe we need to try something out, test it, see if it works, see what the consequences are, real and unintended, see what the options are, and then come back and pass a different regulation or a different technology. And our message truly is more complicated. And I'll say one last thing on this, because this is kind of one of my pet issues around this office and in this whole movement. The other side uses images all the time. So Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, a masterful piece of propaganda. Scare the heck out of little kids. Let's show this in the 3rd grade over and over again, all the way until you graduate. And these poor kids are looking at, you know, polar bears that look like they're drowning, and ice that's melting and caving into the oceans, and hurricanes and baked deserts and floods. This is scary stuff. These are powerful images, and if you've ever lived through a flood or a hurricane, you relate to this stuff at a deep level. And if somebody says, look, we got to stop global warming because otherwise it's going to increase the number of hurricanes, hey, if you've lived through a hurricane, if you had a house damaged by a hurricane, that's all you need to hear. And there's no way Joe Bast is going to convince you that global warming is not man-made, or maybe it is, but it's only a little bit, and we shouldn't worry about it, and the cost of doing something about it is more than the benefits. I mean, you hear what I'm saying. I'm explaining, and this guy's already made his decision. They say in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. And libertarians are explaining. We're explaining how the world works. We're explaining how freedom is necessary, how freedom, at the end of the day, more freedom solves all these problems. It gives us the technology, the innovation, the productivity, the wealth, but we got to protect the freedom. And the first instinct of most people is to restrict freedom. When they see a problem, the solution is limit freedom, don't expand freedom. It's a huge problem, big problem.
Yeah, we explain that constantly. It seems that that's all we do. Certainly at Unbiased America, and I know at We Are Capitalists, that's pretty much what we do on a daily basis. I wanted to ask you one last question before we have to go. And you said that you vote for the Libertarian Party most of the time. Who are you supporting in the Libertarian race this year? I mean, if I was supporting anybody, it would be Austin Peterson. I mean, are you a Gary Johnson guy? Or are you an Austin Peterson guy?
I guess I'm a Gary Johnson guy. Yeah,
right.
Sorry.
All right, I'm going.
At least he didn't say John McAfee.
Yeah, thank goodness. See, if Trump's the nominee, I'm going all in for Austin Peterson.
Yeah.
Am I crazy, guys?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Do you want to talk politics? Do we have 60 seconds?
We do. Go ahead.
So President Donald Trump.
Terrifying. That is a terrifying thought to me. Maybe the next depression. He could probably spark the next depression.
I'm in California, though. You see, Hillary's going to win my state anyway. To get me to leave my house, I actually have to be into it. And I'm not into voting for Donald Trump, so I would prefer to go and cast my vote for Austin Peterson for president. I'm not even kidding. I like the guy. He's a pro-American libertarian. He's a conservatarian. I would do it. And Gary Johnson's kind of part of that old libertarian establishment mentality. I'm going for the new young blood. Call me crazy.
Well, I'm with you 100% on that.
All right, Mike, come on, go in for Peterson here.
Hey, I voted for Gary Johnson in 2012. I'll vote for him again.
Oh, he's old news, Mike.
Yeah, you establishment shill.
But I want to thank Joe. I really want to thank you for coming on. That was an excellent show. You're not as crazy as your Wikipedia page says you are, and as the D-Smog blog. D-Smog blog really has it out for you, by the way. Jeez. That is a garbage on that thing. I've always hated the Smog blog. But thanks again for coming on. Hopefully we can have you on again at some point. Please follow Grant Phillips at his page, The Modern Libertarian, a great page. Also, We Are Capitalists. Kevin Ryan, obviously, at Unbiased America. You can find us on Facebook. We have a new website that's launching in a couple of weeks or so. So look out for that. And for Joe, you can visit the Heartland Institute at heartland.org, and you could buy the book. The book will be out soon, right? Right, Joe? When's the book coming out? Do you know?
The whole book,
Yeah.
final volume of Climate Change Reconsidered, I don't know.
You don't
All
know,
right?
Okay.
Stop bugging me about it.
yeah,
Stop
right.
asking about it. It'll come out when it's finished.
I just can't wait. I will probably email you when we get off the show. When is your book coming out? But the chapter is out, and you can find it at heartland.org. It's excellent. Thanks again for coming on, and stay on after we go off the air, so we can talk when we get off the air. All right,
Sounds
Mike.
great. Thank you.
Mike, hit the
No, I'm not going to do it.